Welcome to the Wednesday night Bible study. We're in the story of Daniel. This is our 7th installment. We're looking at Daniel chapter 5 tonight. And I titled this, Writing on the Wall. Writing on the Wall. That phrase, read the handwriting on the wall, you may have used or heard. That comes from this story. So last week, the king had a dream about a tree. Daniel interpreted it. And it came out that the king would think he was a beast, an animal, for 7 years. A way for God to show he was truly in charge. A year later, that's what happened. And 7 years later, the king raised his eyes toward heaven, and his sanity was completely restored. So he was truly converted, King Nebuchadnezzar was. What does he say about God? In chapter 4, it ends with this, in chapter 4, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Nebuchadnezzar was definitely humbled. Okay, now we begin chapter 5 with this. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Now, who is this King Belshazzar? There's been about a quarter of a century has occurred between chapter 4 and chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, which was probably not long after the end of chapter 4, where he told his story. There's been a deterioration of the empire since then, intrigue and murder among the leaders. The spiritual lessons Nebuchadnezzar learned were forgotten or not heeded, we're going to see in chapter 5. So I have a chart here. I wish I had more time for those who find it interesting, but there was a succession of rulers, beginning with his son, Evil Merodach, number 2, and then you see 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 6 leaders, starting with Nebuchadnezzar and ending with Belshazzar, the king that we're talking about in chapter 5. Boy, I'd like to tell you a lot about this. There were some assassinations. Look at Belshazzar. He's the son of the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. The son-in-law is Nebuchadnezzar, and he is actually the empire leader. He's the king of the empire. Whereas Belshazzar is king or co-regent of Babylon. Okay. That comes into play a little bit later. Okay, so the last 10 or more years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, that was the father of Belshazzar, he spent most of his time in the North Arabian capital, and all the administration of Babylon's capital was left to his son Belshazzar. And that explains a few things about the characters in this story. A couple other things that you're going to run into. Nebuchadnezzar is called Belshazzar's father, but really it's his grandfather. It sounds like a mistake, but there's just no term for grandfather. And the queen is Belshazzar's mother. She's the queen mother. All right, so setting the scene here. Daniel's in his 80s. He's probably in semi-retirement, if not retirement completely. The Medo-Persian military is rising against the Babylonian Empire. And while Belshazzar is at the capital, Nebuchadnezzar's army is fighting the Medo-Persians. And they had to retreat, and leaving the Medo-Persians access to Babylon. Babylon, though, is considered impenetrable, with several years' provisions. Okay, now, back to the first verse. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Okay, this is quite a blasphemous thing, using the Jewish gods' sacred items that were from the temple for raising toasts to their polytheistic gods of gold and silver, etc., etc. So what do you suppose this banquet was going on? Explanation might be that it was to allay the people's fears. The Medo-Persians were on the attack. but this was showing contempt for the Medo-Persians. Hey, we're having a party here. We're not worried. We're not afraid. And why did he use the goblets? Well, that seems to show his contempt for the power of God, the Jewish God. The party does change, though, in verse 5, though. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. So this is where we get the phrase, read the handwriting on the wall. Would you find it scary if a hand appeared and started writing on your wall? I know I would, and I think my knees would be knocking too. What did the king do? The king, Belshazzar, called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. So like his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, that was his strategy. Bring in the experts and offer a big reward. The big reward was the best he could offer, the third highest ruler in the kingdom, since he was the second highest ruler in the kingdom. Well, then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing to tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. So once again, the wise men were called upon, and once again they failed, just like in Nebuchadnezzar's day. Okay, a new character enters the story, and that is the queen. In verse 10, the queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods." Any guesses to who that might be? Let's read on. "King Nebuchadnezzar," she says, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners." Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar's chief of the magicians, who he was? I'm sure you guessed who she's talking about. She continues, "This man, Daniel," that's who it is, "whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." That was quite a nice recommendation from the queen. And then verse 13, "So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, 'Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father and king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you were able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems.'" And here's the incentive. "If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." So this old man, this old Hebrew man, Daniel, who's not known to King Belshazzar, is kind of a last resort. The king's going to rely on the abilities of a Hebrew. You'll notice that just like his grandfather, Babylonian kings like to give huge incentives to solve their issues. Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means." So Daniel doesn't want any rewards, but he's going to interpret it. First, we're about to read. Daniel takes the opportunity to do three things. First of all, to remind or reteach the king who really rules the world. Secondly, give the king a history lesson on what the Most High God thinks about pride. And thirdly, without mincing words, tell it like it is for the king. So here we go with verse 18. "O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor." This is Daniel talking. "Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled." In other words, God is calling the shots. The Most High God is calling the shots. Next comes the history lesson. But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and set over them anyone he wishes. Now comes to telling it like it is. But you, his grandson, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines, drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. You see how he describes the Babylonian gods. They can't see, they can't hear, they can't understand. In other words, they don't really exist. And then there's the wordplay in verse 23. The God who holds in his hand your life is the one who sent the hand that writes the inscription. Let's get to the writing on the wall. On verse 17. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, pharsin. Written in Aramaic. It's puzzling why the wise men couldn't read it. Maybe it was script and not cuneiform. Possibly only the consonants appeared. Maybe it was on familiar form of the characters. Who knows why? But Daniel then explains it. This is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting or deficient. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So this is probably no surprise for Daniel. Remember the image of chapter 2, the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and the second phase of the times of the Gentiles, represented by the silver chests and arms. That was the Medo-Persian Empire. And also, there's another thing. The prophet Jeremiah had given a hint, and perhaps Daniel had read this prophecy. In Jeremiah, verse 27, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Tell this to your masters. With my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are on it, and I gave it to anyone I please. Now I will hand all your countries over to my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. So that did happen. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. And then in verse 7, all nations will serve him and his son and his grandson until the time for his land comes. Then many nations and great kings will subjugate him. So that is what happened. His grandson was the last, we're going to see, and it begins subjugation of Babylon by other folks. Then, at Belteshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. It is going to be pretty pointless, but the king did keep his word. Why is it pointless? Because in verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. So what an irony. The Babylonian Empire began with conquering Jerusalem, conquering the Judah people. Yet its last official act was to honor one of the original captives, Daniel. There's a phrase, man may have the first word, but God will have the last. I might have time to bring this up. Historians, a Greek historian and other historians have recounted how this was accomplished. Here Babylon was so impenetrable. While the Babylonians felt secure, were even partying, this historian says, the Persians diverted the water of the Euphrates River, which ran through the city, to a nearby lake, waded in the deep thigh-deep water, entered the city, and took it over. So had the Babylonians been paying attention, their soldiers could have climbed the walls on both sides of the river and picked them off like dead ducks. So had they not been partying, using those goblets, history might be very different. Now, both the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah prophesied about the downfall of Babylon. Isaiah in chapter 47, verse 1 through 5, he prophesies the way Babylon fell. I encourage you to read that. There were prophecies of the fall of Babylon on a night of partying found in Isaiah chapter 13, verses 17 through 22, Isaiah 21, verses 1 through 10, and Jeremiah chapter 51, 33 through 58. Why is this chapter about the end of the empire recorded in the Word of God? Why is the end of the empire such a big deal? Why am I bringing it up? It's Daniel's in the story, but he's not really terribly important, although he is, again, being helped by God. But the end of the empire being such a big deal it's a historic fulfillment of prophecies. Isaiah prophesied, Jeremiah prophesied, Daniel prophesied. And it's an illustration of God dealing with a wicked world. The downfall of Babylon, in some ways, is a type of what will be happening when Jesus comes in his second coming. The world will feel secure, the world will be unprepared, and the world will be defenseless against God's judgment when the time comes, just like it happened in Babylon. That's it for this story. Take care. We'll continue next week. In the meantime, may the Lord be with you.